Ladies and gentlemen, good friends, as we are talking about victims, the greatest victim of communism was the soul or spirituality of humans. The very humanity replaced by bestiality. It would be an improper action to celebrate a so long-lasting disaster, but we have an opportunity to concentrate more on it in an effort to understand. Bolsheviks of Russia were populists who claimed and promised freedoms, great and just benefits for everybody, excluding enemies, and peace for nations. But they developed a regime of terror, slavery to the state, and war. Alongside with the Marxist ideology of class struggle, the whole world should turn communist. Of Russian shape, of course. Immediate war and export of revolution were the means. Thus, aggression and disaster were not intended to be confined just inside Russia. On the contrary, everywhere. That is an ongoing process of world revolution and bloody gaining in idea of the world governance, which has no end yet. Now it is a basic thing to understand at least the newest European history. The totalitarian regime of Bolsheviks became an example and inspiration for other fascist ideologies and dictatorships. Let us now concentrate on what was badly creative to get the world of today sick and half crazy. The Bolsheviks took root in the naked rationalism of the 18th, 19th centuries. The understanding of the nature of human dualism, anima et ratio, became wrongly reduced to preferring ratio, while anima was increasingly treated as marginal. Talks about human heart and brotherhood were left for poetry and outdated Christian religion. The concept of history became mystified and given, with its rules discovered by Marx and company, the features of a deity or supranatural predestination. Serve history. Leaving aside all stages and options of that negative trend of culture, including politics, I'll try to make some remarks about the results of this 100 years long development in Russia. Why Russia? Because for a while, until the third collapse of that specific empire is still approaching, the case of Russia presents number one among the current threats and dangers for the entire human world. This view is not demonization, but realism. Human world is getting more and more dehumanized. Unfortunately, Russia plays, unconsciously, a big role in that evil process. That is a real stance and situation for a while. But we are also living for a while. Illness of the world is now concentrated at best expressed in Russia. And the illness of Russia itself is inherited from its past and continues until the current practices. Let us take some aspects of Russia's mentality. Large, the largitude. After all successes of land conquest and partial colonization, Russia is large indeed. If your mentality is prevailing territorial, you may suffer a sort of delirium of grandness or grandomania in your strive to enjoy being ever larger, until all seas was the claim of tsars. The Indian Ocean is not reached yet. The largest in the world, what an excitement. Vast, but looks fine on the map. As the consequence, diminishing of such sacred territory becomes enormously painful, like a tragedy for the mankind. So begins the wrong system of values in action. The largitude of your dominions is able to compensate for the failures in all the rest senses, supposedly even the failures in anyone's mentality. Rule Russia, the globe, with us and me in the center of the universe. That's the victorious secret of Kremlin. For such Russia, it is worth to live, to die, and to kill. So declares the top ideologist of the Putinist Russia, well, Kremlin, Mr. Alexander Dugin. This current Russia, as a state and its leadership, are on a fundamentally wrong path. To a great extent, the trend is stemming from theoretical and practical communism. The only right teaching, mystical communism, should eliminate any other understanding of world affairs as wrong, erroneous, one and hostile to the people of nomenclatura, thus counter-revolutionary. And the best medicine for contrasts was to annihilate them. Of course, if you have a sufficient force. As Chairman Mao has said, who has the gun, he rules the village. Who then dares to oppose Big Me and history simply drops out of the game, out of life. That was the base of the Red Terror, introduced by Lenin and highly developed by Stalin. Here we should correct the commonly used term of crimes of communism, not the abstract idea or teaching, but concrete persons, organized structures, and the entire states appeared to be killers. Political opponents and economic opponents rejecting slavery, like the working and productive peasantry, should be expropriated and eliminated as class. That social racism stays not investigated yet. The ultimate means, the artificial fame in Holodomor, was implemented by fanatic Bolsheviks to break and crush normal Ukrainian countryside. Millions died of starvation, left without food under the merciless observance of the rulers' perpetrators. In the view of their history, this was a right thing. Undoubtedly, in normal understanding, it had nothing in common with humanity, but with bestiality. Some say, especially communist pundits, that destruction of private and family farming helped Stalin to build up industry, the military one par excellence, and to win the war. But communism of Bolsheviks destroyed Russia more than any war. Common people, the population of that big country, already even longer than half a century after the war, still remains in a hungry for goods and hostile poverty. The only difference to explain such situation then and now is that previously the surrounding capitalism was guilty for that. and today the Americans and NATO. Let me miss some part of this lecture. And then about the them and L as political environment. They are around Russia. Stepping on its wrong path of expansionism, the post-communist or neo-fascist Russia did appear just recently in a new self-isolation, approaching to be a big version of North Korea. We will beat them. We will win over them. This mantra governs Kremlin's strategic mind. Don't forget that we have a bomb, Mr. Putin goes repeating. Whom? Damned enemies, as we Russians are besieged by them. The idea of a surrounded fortress Russia has two sources, apropos deeply inherited. The first one was the vision of Tsars. The second one was the vision of Lenin and company with the Soviet means as a permanent revolution of Trotsky and permanent enlargement of the USSR, the oath of Stalin at Lenin's coffin. So the open process until the Red Empire with its satellites governs the whole world, not less. Therefore, hopeless were our friendly suggestions of that global foreign enemy that Russia should prefer the well-being of its own people to the liberation of the rest. Boris Yeltsin was a unique leader of Russia who wanted to remake it into a normal, internationally cooperative and national welfare-building state. It did not happen, unfortunately. Additional remarks, maybe going to the end, can be made as regards the wrong mind of the deeply unfortunate Russia. Take the prime of pride and respect. Those proud of might and cruelty, they wish to be respected. The lack of appeasing respect turns to be a terrible abuse. I have experienced this in the last Soviet years, when in a political dialogue you disagree, even in most polite manner, with an alleged boss. Speaking as an equal and looking into the eyes, you seem provoking and annoying. Do respect your master. Thus, disobedience of younger sister Ukraine must be punished severely. Only Yeltsin was different. Recent situation became not better, but worse. They must fear us. If they don't fear us, we are disrespected. The greatest failure of the West was the end of Cold War. No peace treaty, no request to recognize the crimes and to punish the communist criminals, no request to change the former inhuman mentality and behavior. Lithuania then went forward with such idea of purification, the tribune for communist crimes. But nobody wanted to listen and consider this. The Budapest Accords became the best example that a paper, even signed, is nothing. What we have now is living in bad heritage. What it looks like. Western democracies are opposing the empire of lie and are rather losing, as they don't dare to say, stop lying, or to say about our being in a global war. Even the bleeding Ukraine is trying to avoid the truth, the clear dictionary. Some say that everything is better than war. Anti-democratic, anti-Western hard and soft tyrants don't think so. War is on their table. Maybe, dear Westerners and Putin's verstehers, your capitulation would be preferable. That is worth to consider. Is it better indeed to sink into a cloaca of liquid shit than dying on a battlefield? In the name of dignity and liberty, to be said. The question of a taste. Let us ask thus our fathers in the heavens. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Short, not a great piece.
Our panel has a title, Accounting Communism's Crimes. And this is a very correct title, because communism and crimes are inseparable, are really inalienable. But what is most striking, the sheer size, scale, scope of crimes committed by communism of the last century. And especially that all those crimes happened not in one country or few countries, but in each country and on each territory that has been captured, occupied, ruled by communists. Those crimes are not the result of mistakes, accidents, or just psychopathy or paranoia of one ruler or few leaders. It happened everywhere without exception, from Russia to all conquered countries and territories, from Ukraine to Cuba, from Finland during Finnish Civil War to Ethiopia and Angola, from Yugoslavia to North Korea and bloodlands of Cambodia. It is a result of systemic application of mass coercion, violence, terror, murder, regardless of any factor, any conditions of existing or non-existent resistance. Why? Why such a scale of crimes? First of all, because of ideology. Communism is pure ideology of terror and terrorism. Let me cite the founder of communism, Karl Marx. There is only one way in which the murderous death agonies of the old society and the bloody birth-throughs of the new society can be shortened, simplified, and concentrated, and that way is revolutionary terror. It's an article in Neue Rheinische Zeitung of November 1848. Another quotation from the same newspaper 1 year later. We have no compassion, and we ask no compassion from you. When our turn comes, we shall not make excuses for our terror. Vladimir Lenin. No revolutionary government cannot avoid executions of landlords and capitalists. Yakov Sverdlov, the head of VCIK, so-called Soviet president. We need to apply mass terror. Grigory Zinoviev, head of Comintern, international communist organization for communist parties around the world. We must inspire with communist ideas and lead 90 million out of 100 million of population of Soviet Russia. We cannot speak to remaining 10 million. They need to be liquidated. End of citation. Why terror was necessary? Because Marxist communism had very clear aim, a new society. Reason for that terror, creation of new society, of new level of homogeneity in this society, without so-called wrong classes, social groups, ethnic communities, in order to create so-called classless society. Again, Marx, the mode of production of material life determined the social, political, and intellectual life process. It is not the consciousness of man that determines their being, but on the contrary, they are social beings that determine their consciousness. Therefore, this social formation is the closing chapter of the prehistoric stage of human society. It means the social strata must be destroyed and their members must be eliminated. Therefore, liquidation of classes meant not abstract categories, but figuratively, not figuratively, but literally, liquidation of each and every member belonging to the so-called wrong classes, social group, ethnic communities. What were the methods of crimes and terror? Many of them, all that have been accumulated by humanity before that. Confiscation of property, deportation, arrests, hostage-taking, confinement to the camps, torture, execution, extrajudicial killings, and so on. What was the chief instrument of these crimes? Secret police, organization of secret police. Certainly we know how communists trying to polish this organization, changing these names and structure, and providing them with more and more power, from VCK, GPU, or GPU, NKVD, NKGB, MGB, KGB to FSB. There is no single communist country without secret police. Secret police and communism are inalienable elements. There are many ways of crimes and terror in Russia, and historians are still debating. I would call at least 4 waves of mass terror, and all of them aimed on those so-called enemies of people, classes, social strata, social groups that considered to be not compatible with classless communist society and deserved to be liquidated. During the first wave of Red Terror, 1917-1922 in Russia, the victims of communism were members of emperor's house, aristocracy, nobility, members of the government of the Russian Empire, governors and general governors of gubernias, members of both chambers of the parliament, Senate and State Duma, generals, admirals, officers of the Imperial Army and Fleet, police and gendarmerie officers, members of all non-communist parties, including leftist parties, public figures, society leaders, journalists, professors, religious leaders, bishops, priests, monks, academics, scientists, persons of culture, arts, cinema, business people, entrepreneurs. During the second wave, successful and wealthy peasants, so-called kulaks, joined the enemies of the people. Bourgeois specialists, historians, even communist officials, the so-called old guard. During the third wave of terror, the so-called Great Terror, remaining members of non-communist parties, imperial army, imperial government leaders and priests, religious, professors, teachers, academicians, and scientists. Also, statisticians, communist officials, officials of Soviet government, Soviet generals and officers, Soviet officials who refused to come back to USSR from abroad, many ethnic groups within the USSR, Germans, Poles, Romanians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Finns, Bulgarians, Greeks, Iranians, Afghans, Koreans, Balkars, Karachai, Kalmyks, Chechens, Ingush, Crimean Tatars, Turks, Meskhetians, Yakuts, Kazakhs, Harbinians, ethnic Russians from Harbin, members of foreign communist parties, international volunteers during civil war in Spain, participants of Uyghur uprising on the territory of China, monks in Mongolia and Tuva. During the fourth wave of terror, Jews, doctors, biologists, economists. If Stalin did not die, the terror wave would continue. How many people have been killed in the former Soviet Union? We don't know this exact number. We have only estimates, as much as we can, some basic numbers. Killed due to communist organized civil war, 2.5 million. Murdered in 4 waves in terror, at least 3 million. Killed, murdered, starved to death in Gulag, 1.6 million. Executed by the Soviet government during the Second World War, 1 million. It's not counting those people who have been killed during the war, that the war itself can be attributed to a very high extent by communists. All people killed due to political reasons, at least 8 million. Starved to death and from epidemics, around 20 million. Deported, emigrated, escaped from the territory of the Soviet Union, 8 million. All human losses, at least 36 million people, or about 24% of the Soviet population in 1922. These mass terror campaigns have been applied in all territories conquered by communists and performed by secret police. It was in Eastern Poland, in Estonia, in Latvia, in Lithuania, in Bessarabia, Bukovina. After the Second World War, in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, Mongolia, Albania, China, Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, and everywhere with the same patterns and same machine of terror, of state terror. Members of government and parliament, government officials, generals and officers of army and police, members of all non-communist parties, religious leaders and priests, professors and teachers, academics and scientists, public figures, persons of culture, art, cinema, intellectuals, business people. In this audience, probably it's worth to remind about the massacre at Hoover in southern Vietnam during the so-called Tet Offensive, when Northern Vietnamese army has taken the old capital of Vietnam, Hoover, just for 4 weeks, from January 30th to February 28th, 1968. When this city has been liberated 8 weeks later, it was found that more than 4,000 people have been killed deliberately by Vietnamese communists. Who are they? Who were they? All non-communist political party members, civil servants, religious leaders, school teachers, American civilians, other foreigners. When I visited in October 2008, liberated territories of Georgia, liberated from the occupation by Russian troops during the short term, that's for that particular territory, short-term aggression against Georgia near Gori district, I found that terror has been applied against families of government officials on that territories, families of officers of army and police, priests, and strikingly, school teachers. Same pattern, same machine, same organization. What kind of lessons we can learn from that, from this 100th century of communism? Unfortunately, ideology of terror, violence, coercion did not die. The practice of monopoly of political power did not die. The secret police, organization that is a chief instrument for committing all those crimes, is still alive in many countries. So as long as this ideology, this practice, and those organizations, especially secret police, are still alive, we cannot say that communism is dead. What to do in this situation, especially when this new generation, like millennials, prefer to live under socialism, or many of them would like to live under socialism? My advice would be very simple. Use every opportunity to tell the true story of communism to all those university professors and students, leftist journalists and intellectuals, government bureaucrats and Hollywood actors. Under real communism, there will be not only millions of new victims, they themselves will be first or one of the first victims of real communism.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here this morning. In the moral calculus of blame for the crimes of communism, the largest share must, of course, be reserved for those who created and led the regimes that engaged in mass murder almost from their origins. The Lenins, Maos, Stalins, Hojas, Kims, and their compatriots deliberately and with malice aforethought concocted plans to transform fundamentally the societies they ruled, and concluded that for reasons of security and success, they had to eliminate large numbers of their fellow citizens whose class background, religion, ideology, or other trait represented an obstacle or a threat. The communist parties they led called upon tens and hundreds of thousands of members motivated by idealism, fanaticism, and in many cases careerism and brutality, who willingly persecuted millions of people guilty of no crime but deemed unworthy material for the beautiful society that was to be constructed. Previous speakers at this conference have eloquently and at length cataloged the crimes of communism. I will not repeat them. But many of the enablers of communism also deserve condemnation and a historical reckoning. Fortunately, for a sizable percentage of them, they lived in Western Europe and the United States, where they were able to spew their lies with impunity. Thus, they survived physically, but they also sold their souls. They devoted their lives to propagandizing on behalf of repressive regimes and retailing the lies manufactured by them. And since the collapse of many communist regimes in the late 1980s and early 1990s, some of them have persisted in denying the crimes of communism, making them the equivalent of Holocaust deniers. In the United States, where the Communist Party never enrolled more than 100,000 members, the communist virus infected significant numbers of intellectuals and creative artists. Men and women, to this day admired as paragons of moral commitment and truth-telling, and honored for their contributions to American cultural life, defended mass murderers, slandered the oppressed, and pretended to be victims when they were called to account. From Lillian Hellman and Arthur Miller to Theodore Dreiser and Paul Robeson, they lent their talents and their names to propaganda designed to buttress communism. In an era in which Americans have had to confront difficult questions about public monuments to slaveholders who waged war on the United States, it seems appropriate that we reconsider public acclaim for people who supported the destruction of their own country, glorified tyrants, and figuratively spat upon their victims. Paul Robeson, the celebrated athlete, actor, and singer, honored by a commemorative stamp a few years ago by the United States Postal Service, sacrificed his career to the cause of communism. Although often presented as a victim of irrational anti-communism, he can stand as a paradigm for the moral failings of communist loyalists. His own son, himself a longtime communist, has told the story of his father's singing tour of the Soviet Union in 1951. He asked to meet his old friend Yitzhak Pfeffer, rumored to have been purged because of his wartime membership in the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. Pfeffer had in fact been arrested, he had been horribly tortured, and was destined to be murdered. He was cleaned up and brought to Robeson's dressing room. Aware that it was bugged, Pfeffer drew his finger across his throat, indicating that he was a dead man. Did Robeson come to the defense of his old friend? No. He added a Yiddish song to his performance that night, and on his return to the United States, stayed silent about Yitzhak Pfeffer. He remained silent until the day he died. At a time when his own public voice might have saved his friend, he betrayed him. Then there are the Jewish communists who denied or apologized for the anti-Semitic Stalinist campaigns of the late 1940s and early 1950s against rootless cosmopolitans. Some of them knew the writers and artists who either disappeared or were publicly denounced, just as they knew Victor Alter or Henrik Ehrlich, Jewish Bund leaders in Poland, arrested and killed by the Soviet Union as Nazi spies. That did not stop these people from condemning not those who killed Alter and Ehrlich and the Jewish writers, Yiddish writers, but protests against their murder. Nor does it now prevent apologists for the dictatorial regimes from parroting the Soviet-invented slander, equating Israel with Nazi Germany and resurrecting anti-Semitism under the guise of anti-Zionism. Most Western communist intellectuals have been less complicit enablers. While the Popular Front period in the late 1930s was the high point of such activities, defending totalitarianism from the safe perch of free societies enjoyed a comeback in the 1970s and 1980s. Intellectuals and professors, as varied as Frederick Jameson and Theodore von Lau, defended Stalin despite his cruelties, or perhaps because of them. This is von Lau in the 1970s about how Soviet totalitarianism was, quote, a remarkable human achievement despite its flaws, end quote. Since it enabled Stalin to build a modern society, and the large number of uneducated peasants he destroyed were an obstacle that had to be surmounted. From his perch at Clark University in Massachusetts, presumably with no uneducated peasants in sight, von Lau had no need to consider the human costs of communism. While most American communists and their defenders did little more than contribute to the lies and public support for tyrannical and cruel regimes, and denied assistance and succor to those it persecuted, a not insignificant number of Americans did more. They actively worked on behalf of the Soviet Union and betrayed their own nation. As a result of material coming out of American and Russian Cold War archives since the collapse of communism, we now can identify more than 350 people, Americans, who worked for Soviet intelligence agencies, primarily the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, and the NKVD, or more popularly known as the KGB, from the 1930s to the early 1950s. We can identify 350. There's another 150 for whom we have code names, but as yet, no identification. Technically, none of these people was a traitor, since the United States was never at war with the Soviet Union. But they were supplying vital information, much of which wound up doing incalculable harm to American interests. During World War II, some of them provided information that enabled the Soviet Union to build an atomic bomb 2 to 3 years before it otherwise would have been able to do with its own resources. Since we now know that Stalin's approval of the North Korean invasion of the South was predicated on Soviet possession of an atomic bomb, it is at least arguable that atomic espionage by Americans enabled the USSR to develop an atomic weapon while Stalin was still alive. Historical what-ifs, always exercises in futurology, but let me offer one. Can the 4 million casualties, including 30,000 dead Americans of the Korean War, plausibly be blamed on those Americans who aided and abetted Soviet intelligence? This sorry record has not prevented far too many Americans from trying to honor apologists for tyranny, and continuing to do so years after their complicity was proven by records from Russian archives. Bard College has an Alger Hiss chair commemorating a man who worked for Soviet intelligence for more than a decade and lied about it for nearly half a century. It's one of the ironies of history that the current holder of that chair is my good friend and editor, Jonathan Brent, who is here and will be speaking on the next panel. As editor of Yale University Press, he created the immensely valuable Annals of Communism series that has done so much to expose communism's crimes. But think about it. An important American university has an Alger Hiss chair. I look forward to the establishment of a Benedict Arnold chair soon. New York University has a website devoted to the innocence of Hiss. New York City, currently earnestly debating tearing down statues of General Grant and Christopher Columbus, passed a resolution honoring Ethel Rosenberg, who aided and abetted her husband's atomic espionage. Other American cities, including Seattle and San Francisco, have honored communist activists with resolutions and statues. Leading American academics have praised communists as avatars of democracy and freedom. Eric Foner, holder of a distinguished chair at Columbia University and a former president of both the Organization of American Historians and the American Historical Association, wrote a book published in 1998 which lavished praise on the Communist Party of the United States for its unparalleled contributions to the advance of American freedom. Less than a decade before that, he had complained, as the Soviet Union was entering its death spiral, he had complained about the efforts of Soviet reformers to document the Gulag. He denounced, quote, the obsessive need to fill in the blank pages of the Soviet system. Think of it, a historian objecting to filling in the blank pages of history. He also urged Gorbachev to deal with calls for Latvian, Estonian, and Lithuanian independence, just as Lincoln treated Southern secession. Relatively few of these enablers of communism have apologized for their years, in many cases decades, of apologetics. Noam Chomsky has refused to own up to his denials of the Cambodian genocide. The New York Times has refused to repudiate the Pulitzer Prize awarded to Walter Duranty, who shamelessly lied about the Ukrainian genocide. While our self-proclaimed paper of record continues to denounce the excesses of the McCarthy era, it has been far less zealous in coming to terms with the now overwhelming evidence about the complicity of hundreds of American citizens with the KGB and the GRU. That record should never be forgotten or forgiven. Thank you.
Delighted to be here. I will speak for about 10 minutes. The themes of the conference are memory, justice, and truth. They're great values, but as a historian of China over the last 3 decades, I've been confronted with untruth and amnesia on a staggering scale. This started when I first went to university in Switzerland in the 1980s. I studied Russian. There were plenty of Sovietologists you could read who were critical of the Soviet Union, Martin Malia, Richard Pipes, Robert Conquest, and of course, Alain Besançon, wonderful man. I also studied Chinese, but where were the sinologists critical of the People's Republic? They were very hard to find. I was lucky in that I picked up a book published in 1971 on the Cultural Revolution, written by a man called Simon Lace. His name was an alias for Pierre Ryckmans, who by vocation was actually an expert on Chinese art in the 19th century. But he wrote searingly about the horrors of Maoism. His work was met with relentless hostility from public intellectuals and professional sinologists alike. They all thought somehow that China was different. Now, of course, China today is very different from what it was in 1971. And there is little doubt that there is far less injustice in China today than at the height of the Cultural Revolution. But on the other hand, truth and memory have not really been allowed to flourish. In the People's Republic, a state of enforced amnesia has been imposed about the past. And across the border in Europe and the United States, there are still plenty of fellow travelers, true believers and other apologists who continue to tell us that China somehow is different. So if we wish to track untruth and amnesia, we should look at both history and historiography. We should look at the crimes committed by the Communist Party in China, but also at the politics of apologia. I shall do so briefly. And I will start in 1949, when the red flag goes up over the Forbidden City in Beijing, a moment the Communist Party refers to as a liberation. It is a term that brings to mind jubilant crowds who take to the streets to celebrate freedom. But the story of liberation and the revolution that followed is not so much about peace, justice, liberty. It is first and foremost a history of systematic violence and calculated terror. For decades, we've been told that the very first act of the regime was land reform, as poor peasants were finally given a plot of land. But land reform was not about the land. It was about destroying local power structures, compelling a majority of villagers to turn against their leaders and eliminate them frequently physically. Work teams were sent into villages by the Communist Party with quotas of victims who had to be denounced, humiliated, dispossessed, sometimes killed by the villagers, assembled by the militia in gigantic denunciation meetings. Nobody was allowed to stand on the sidelines. Those who did, of course, became victims themselves. Many of the victims were not only humiliated and dispossessed, but killed. There are detailed reports from the archives from the number 2 in the power hierarchy, Liu Shaoqi, who writes about how some of these people accused of being landlords were hung from trees, dismembered, throttled to death, sometimes buried alive. There were children slaughtered as little landlords. What happened is that these victims had assets that were distributed to the perpetrators, in effect creating a pact between the poor and the party, a pact sealed in blood. To put it in a nutshell, land reform had to create a quantity of blood sufficient to make a return to the past impossible. A year later came a great terror. Its purpose was to eliminate all those who stood in the path of revolution. Mao, Chairman Mao, gave a killing quota of 1 per 1,000, but in many regions, 2 or 3 times as many people were killed by willing executioners who tried to show how tough they were. Many cases were based on nothing but a mere decision by a local cadre. In Sichuan, entire villages were razed to the ground. There are cases of children aged 6 accused of spying for the enemy and tortured to death. Sometimes local cadres just took a couple of prisoners and summarily executed them in order to meet this quota of 1 per 1,000. There's a beautiful document in the Shanxi Provincial Archives, written by the Minister of Public Security, a man called Luo Ruiqin. He had a portrait of Felix Dzerzhinsky in his office. He wrote to Chairman Mao to announce that 301,800 people had been executed in a mere 6 provinces by the end of 1950. A year later, by 1951, at least 2 million people were killed, in addition to the 2 million people who had been liquidated during land reform. Now, even at the time, these atrocities would have been quite evident, not least through the reports that the regime published itself, but also thanks to material that was smuggled into Hong Kong across the border. In 1955, a man called Richard Walker published a book entitled China Under Communism, the First 5 Years. His account of the terror has been amply vindicated by the archival evidence that has come to light recently. But he was hounded out of the field by the Dean of Chinese Studies in this country, a man called John King Fairbank, Professor of Chinese History at Harvard University, a scholar who's done more than others to make sure that the People's Republic got a very good press. The work of Richard Walker continues to be denounced to this very day, although it was published in 1955. A good example would be a book ambiguously entitled Dilemmas of Victory, published a few years ago, in which terror and land reform are reduced to a more 4 pages. It's a book that looks at the first 5 years of the regime, just like Richard Walker did. There are chapters on comic theater and midwives in the countryside. That's how far we have come in the China field. In 1958, this is the second episode I will look at very briefly, millions of people in the countryside were herded into giant collectives called people's communes. Chairman Mao thought that by turning every villager into a foot soldier in a giant army to be deployed day and night to transform the economy, he could pretty much catapult his country into utopia. But the Great Leap Forward was a disaster, as tens of millions of people were starved, worked, beaten to death. There is an abundance of evidence from the archives that shows how food was used as a weapon, as local cadres deliberately starved those who were too old or too young, too sick, too weak, to earn their keep and contribute to the regime through their labor. Lenin, I believe, a long time ago, said that he who does not work shall not eat. That principle was applied quite literally. There's also plenty of evidence, in particular transcripts of leadership meetings, that shows that Chairman Mao Mao was perfectly aware of what was happening, yet pressed ahead with the great leap forward and collectivization nonetheless. Of course, there was evidence at the time. There were thousands of refugees who managed to escape and cross the border into Hong Kong. Their testimonies were dismissed as tainted by sinologists. Contrast this to the Harvard Project, in which hundreds upon hundreds of Russian immigrants were interviewed, their testimonies carefully transcribed and archived. As late as 2009, there were only 2 books on the topic of the Great Famine. They were both written by journalists. One, Jasper Becker, a journalist from England, a book entitled Hungry Ghosts. The second, a book translated as Tombstone, published in Chinese by Yang Qisheng. Where were the sinologists? They were nowhere to be seen. Episode number 3, the Cultural Revolution. After the disaster of the Great Leap Forward, as tens of millions of people disappeared into a giant black hole, the chairman may have thought that someone might denounce him, in the same way that Khrushchev had denounced his erstwhile master Stalin. But of course there was a problem. How could Mao spot the Chinese Khrushchev when Stalin himself had failed to identify his nemesis? So Mao's answer was a great purge called the Cultural Revolution. He unleashed ordinary people and allowed them to attack any member of the party at any level. Once they had done their job, Mao used the army to purge the people in turn. Now, only the most blinkered ideologist at the time would have been unable to somehow see at least some of the insanity and destruction of the Cultural Revolution. Simon Lace, the man I mentioned early on, was based in Hong Kong. He saw bodies tied together float down the Pearl River into Victoria Harbour. In Hong Kong, newspapers published eyewitness accounts almost daily. Yet very little was published on the topic. About a year ago, 5 sinologists marked the 50th anniversary of the Cultural Revolution by publishing a piece in the LA Review of Books. You might think that their concern would have been to point out what went wrong with the Cultural Revolution. Instead, they attempted to salvage it, find out what could be recuperated. The chairman died in 1976. It was followed by 2 decades of at least relative tolerance and some debate about the Cultural Revolution. There was a flurry of memoirs published in the 1980s. From 1998 to 2014, the archives were relatively open. Even then, of course, there were constraints, in particular when it comes to public debates about the Great Famine. But all that has changed. When the last man in charge came to power in 2012, Mr. Xi, he declared that any attempt to look at any one episode of the history of the Chinese Communist Party is tantamount to committing the crime of historical nihilism. This sounds suitably intimidating, and this is, of course, exactly what happens. In concrete terms, the secret services approach historians in Shanghai, Beijing, and elsewhere and tell them not to publish anything on the period after 1949. A retired historian recently was told that he would lose his pension. And if that weren't enough, he was also told his entire family would lose access to social services. Websites on oral history have been closed down. The few private museums on the Cultural Revolution have closed their doors. Even in Hong Kong, there's an attempt to impose a state of forced amnesia. Books about the past have disappeared from the shelves, in particular after 5 publishers went missing a few years ago, only to reappear in the People's Republic to confess their crimes on state television. Suitably intimidating, I would say. But forget Hong Kong. The People's Republic now has the clout to impose its own version of history on publishers and universities abroad. It is now enough in Australia for a university lecturer to refer to Taiwan as an independent country, to be pressured into issuing a public apology to students from China. So, farewell. Truth and memory. Welcome back, George Orwell.